Hey, it's Halloween, folks.
Happy Halloween, everybody.
News. Isn't it wonderful? With more coverage, more technology than ever before, there's never been so many stories to tell.
Right now, from coast to coast.
And don't they tell them well?
It's all coming down to this night and this choice.
Tune in to the real-life theatre of the modern age. And best of all, it's live.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Or maybe his wife was asking what else the cow was sucking off. Maybe I shouldn't have said that on telly.
Where would we be without our trusty news reporters? Our guides to the 24-hour deluge of information.
Well, we have raised this as a government, yes.
Have you personally?
No, the Foreign Secretary has raised
But why, when there are so many of them, do they all sound so similar?
Police at bay as the Texas culture.
There's the more serious voice.
The Bosnian food drop, but is it in the right hands?
And the more light-hearted stuff.
And bath time. We meet the baby rhino who's thrilled to be taking a dip.
As a journalism student, I have to watch an awful lot of news. But with such set formulas, when it comes to creating my own work, it's kind of difficult not to sound like this guy.
And we've just heard that areas in 3 of Britain's biggest cities are being evacuated due to suspect dogs.
We want to find out why this phenomenon exists and how young journalists can find their news voice without sounding like a complete caricature.
I definitely think there's this feeling of like, I should sound this way. And especially when you're starting out or when you haven't really thought very much about it. You're like, oh yes, the broadcast news sounds like Walter Cronkite.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm on the air right at the moment. Can you hold the line just a second?
I think it's important to get away from that and say, well, you know, okay, maybe there's a reason why there's this authoritative voice or whatever, but ultimately it's not you and it's obvious. For example, I don't actually really like listening to BBC News. To be honest. Like, I think their reporting is great and that, you know, the content's good, but just because for me it all kind of sounds the same and it all sounds this sort of formal, stilted, I tune it out.
Buckingham Palace said the end was peaceful and the Queen was at her side.
I really want to hear that somebody cares about what they're telling me.
City officials say the victim was a civilian and what happened did not involve police. The protests come...
Why is it always the same voice? Well, journalists always work in a hurry most of the time, so they don't have time to do their voice again and again. The second reason would be that, well, you don't want the audience to pay attention to the journalist or to his or her voice. You want the audience to pay attention to the information.
More than 600 people have reportedly been killed in the rebel-held area. That is one of many battles.
If you're carrying a story like Syria, you've got to put on a much deeper, a much slower, more. You've got to have a bit of gravitas. You're not going to go up to somebody in the streets and go, "Oh, have you heard the latest? What's happened in Syria?" Whereas when you're talking about, you know, doing an item about Christmas, it's much more chatty, much more up and down. You can ad-lib a lot more and make it much more fun. I mean, to be honest, I think most people who are doing it professionally as a job have pretty good news voices. I mean, there are people who have their own certain styles. I mean, thinking, for example, of someone like Robert Peston.
So, is Corbyn's Labour sailing to woohoo or boo-hoo?
Because he's got that kind of character behind him and he's covering, he covers politics now, it kind of works in that kind of environment. There's a journalist at the BBC called Orla Guerin who does tend to do very serious, very heavy stories, gets sent to a lot of war zones.
No list of names of all of those who were killed, and that's just the way the authorities want it.
You wouldn't send her to do the piece about Christmas shopping on Boxing Day.
People very keen to get inside and get their hands on some of those Boxing Day bargains. Many of the people we spoke to quite excited about it.
If you're talking in the middle of talking about business news and the person you know quite well and they start giggling and you start giggling and you have to kind of hold that back and stop yourself. I mean, yeah, that happens all the time.
10 people, including 5 children, have been killed after a building collapsed in India. Emergency crews...
But giggling aside, how can we improve our news voices?
I've heard students or I've heard, you know, people here who, when they started out initially, you're like, ooh, and you can see that they've mellowed out or they've found their voice. They've either, you know, figured out where positioning in their body it needs to be or how relaxed or not relaxed they need to be or figured out to write in much shorter sentences. And if you can imagine that you're sitting there telling the story to somebody, and I even feel like when I'm writing this now, I think, you know, if I were telling this to you, first of all, you write it differently. It makes more sense that way. And then the way you deliver it too. And you realize that if you're talking to somebody, you sound a bit different than if you're talking just to yourself or just trying to mechanically read something out.
Get a script, record yourself and listen back, and perhaps even listen back to it after you've listened to a radio or television news bulletin to compare whether your voice sounds sort of similar. I mean, it has to be a voice that's engaging, that's going to grab the audience and is going to make you think, oh, that's interesting. And it's got to not be too monotone, but at the same time, if you're going up and down all the time, it just sounds ridiculous. You've got to find that right kind of level and volume and speed so that it sounds right.
So, project your voice, record yourself and listen back. Speak like you were chatting to a mate. It sounds pretty easy, except it's not. As I recently discovered, finding your news voice is pretty difficult, and I'm definitely not there yet. Check out, for example, this absolutely ridiculous radio report I made a few weeks ago.
A lone bagpiper walks slowly down the aisle at Notre Dame Cathedral to open today's remembrance service. November the 11th marks the 99th anniversary of the Battle of Passchendaele, one of the bloodiest episodes of World War I.
It looks like some of us could do with a bit more practice.